My name is Michelle Aaron, and I work within the Department of Film and Television Studies at the University of Warwick. I've always been fascinated by the power of film, by the potential of film to affect or even effect personal, social, and political change. All my work throughout my career has been focused on these questions of the value of film, of its political role. I always say small political because I don't mean how it impacts, how it affects governments and policies. I mean how it affects people, how it causes people to reinforce their attitudes or change their attitudes. And I've always been constantly concerned about how film bolsters all the good and bad stuff actually in our world. In the last 5 years, this has sort of taken on new meaning for me. During this period, I've been particularly, I guess, interested or concerned with questions of my own value as an academic. I think the role of the academic, of the researcher within the institutions of the university has changed. Certainly we have to think about impact in a new way. My work has always been about impact in I guess, an old way. And as I'm being asked to think about it in this new way, it's really made me reevaluate what it is to be an academic, what it is to have, I guess, purpose. As someone who has always been committed to cultural politics, to the socio-political role of individuals, of civilians in everyday life, this has taken on new meaning. And so it was about 5 years ago that rather than only be engaged in more traditional forms of academic work, writing articles, writing books, as we are within the arts and humanities in particular, I wanted to turn my fascinations outwards. I wanted to turn the kinds of questions that preoccupied me and the skills that I think I'd accumulated during my years of work to something more concrete. And so on one hand, I set up a social justice film festival in the town that I live in, Birmingham, and the region that I work in. And now in its 7th year, it takes place in both Birmingham and Coventry. This year, it will primarily take place in Coventry because, of course, with the exciting City of Culture events, it forms part of that calendar, both within the cities and the university's schedules of activities. But as well as wanting to develop and extend the audiences for social justice film, I also wanted to take questions that had always preoccupied me, principally the representation of human adversity on film that historically I had looked at in relation to mainstream cinema and always found it wanting, always seen it as unethical, actually. I wanted to take those concerns and think about them more in terms of how they might be changed, how they might be challenged, how I might be involved in creating films, screen narratives that did death and dying differently. One of the major projects, one of the major monographs, but books that I'd been involved in, that I wrote in recent times, was on death and dying. And it really did come to criticize the mainstream film and television for its lack of authentic or ethical representations of human fragility, vulnerability, suffering, and disability. I believe that film is an incredibly important medium precisely because of its ethics. I don't mean that it is ethical. Inherently, it isn't. It is inherently engaged in an ethical encounter. It asks us to come into contact with the experience of others. It asks us to feel for, to feel with, to share in the experiences, the humanity, often the suffering of others, though also the joy. And in that connection, in that ask, in that task of us connecting to the experience of others, we are engaged in inherently ethical experience. I am, of course, indebted, as so many thinkers on ethics within the arts and humanities are, to the work of continental philosophers, in particular the work of Emmanuel Levinas, who has been so influential on the development of ethical film criticism. And really from that work, I see film as bringing us into direct connection with the suffering of others and asking us to have some kind of ethical obligation to the well-being of the other on the screen. So in this way, when I turned my attention to the making of films, it was very much to the making of ethical films. What I mean by this is that the films needed to somehow, I hope, and hoped, connect with the spectator, to tell a truth that led the spectator to have an ethical connection with that experience, to understand the experience of suffering that was being articulated on screen in a way that didn't just lead them to sentimentality or pity or sympathy, but rather to something slightly more productive, because sentimentality and sympathy can be very useful for getting us to feel big things, but it's not necessarily useful in getting us to do something with those feelings. And that's really what I was interested in exploring. The research project that was set up and was funded, thankfully, by the AHRC was called Life Moving. I partnered with a hospice in North Birmingham, the wonderful John Taylor Hospice in Erdington, and through a series of workshops that took place over 6 months, I and the filmmaker I was working with, Brian E. Campbell, conducted these workshops in which we developed the critical and practical skills of the individuals taking part. These were very collaborative, very participatory in nature. It was very much about developing an ethical praxis in doing the research, as well as through the making of the films. So the films were meant to be the product of ethical praxis on a variety of levels. That which was taking place in those collaborative workshops, that was taking place in the kind of thinking that we as researchers and facilitators were engaged with, the kind of relinquishing of power that has to be integral to that leveling of the experience in that workshop, so that everyone is learning from each other, and that the films themselves understood the ethical experience of watching them. And when we created the exhibition that sat with that research, we very much had that in mind. We wanted people to be able to connect to the films in an environment that encouraged that again didn't create a sense of the sensationalism or the illicit of what they were seeing, or over dramatize the sentimentality or sympathy that they might cause, but rather that they might be productive. Since that initial project, I've managed to gain follow-on funding that has allowed me to take these films to different communities, both in this country, in Europe, and around the world. Most recently, I shared the films with different groups, both at large conventions for the end-of-life community and for different community groups, both filmmakers, medical students, to name a few, within the countries that I visited, Uganda, Rwanda, and various places in Australia. As a result of these, the films are going to be turned, and I'm currently involved finally in turning them into two kinds of training resources that will, on one hand, allow end-of-life professionals to gain the insights from the films that they have told us are there and that should be shared with the wider community of end-of-life professionals, that the films give really important insights into the experience of patients that staff don't necessarily know is happening. It gives new insight into their role and into what they understand about their patients' experience of terminal illness. On the other hand, we learned that the films are valuable for generating discussion about end-of-life issues in the wider community, and we want them to be used for that. We also know that the project modeled a valuable therapeutic and artistic project that other hospices or communities might want to be engaged in. And the final training resource is very much about allowing the films and our experience on the project to work, I guess, as good practice, but to work as a ethical praxis for running the same kinds of projects, and allowing the therapeutic, artistic and advocacy benefits to be shared with a much larger audience.